Well, thank you guys for having me today. I came to New Orleans about 6.5 years ago, and knew very little about this city. My parents were originally from North Louisiana, but if you know anything about Louisiana, North and South Louisiana are two different countries. They don't like each other. They don't relate to each other well. They're not culturally similar in any way. And so coming to New Orleans, I've been to New Orleans for beignets and football games, and that was about it. I knew nothing about the city. I didn't know where Kenner was, didn't know what Metairie was, any of that. I knew New Orleans in general because I went to Louisiana College, but other than that, I really had no working knowledge of New Orleans other than it was a pretty open mission field. And when God called me here, I knew for certain that this is where God was leading my wife and I. At the time, we were in Canada. And it was 40 below, and we felt the call to go to New Orleans. And so I never complain about the heat, but as we moved down here, I had a sense that this is where God was leading us. 6.5 years later, what I would tell you is that not only was that accurate, but as I look back on my life, I can tell you that God had prepared me for such a time as this. That what I'm doing now, God spent 45 years preparing me for this time and this place. When I look at my life and the experiences and the things that God used to shape me and the relationships that I have, I can say without a doubt that where I am today is divinely or strategically, I was put there by God, and He knew that a long time ago and began preparing me for that. And so my wife and I love the city. We love being here. We feel like we're going to be here until we grow old, although I'm already getting old, but until we grow older, we feel like we'll be here a long time. And we love our city, and we love reaching people for Christ. We love seeing more than half of our congregation. If I ask on any given Sunday, how many of you have ever been a member of another church? More than 50% were saved and baptized at Williams Boulevard Baptist Church. Which is pretty exciting because you're beginning generations of believers. Many of our people are first-generation Christians. A lot of them were nominal Catholics before they came to know the Lord in a personal way. But our church is filled with people that are the foundation of the next generation of believers, not just a continuation of a generation. And so it's exciting to be a part of that and help plant that. And because of Katrina, there was a lot of rebuild and a lot of newness. And one of the challenges for us is our community changed. Kenner demographically changed, especially at Katrina, but even before then. And so one of our challenges is we want to look like our community. We want to be diverse like our community. We want to reach our community for Christ. We're one of those churches where a lot of people moved away. They moved out to Laplace, and a lot of people moved to the North Shore, and they moved out of Kenner, and other people moved in, immigrants from other places. And Katrina has helped us reinvent ourselves and become the community again. It was at one time, and then it went through a drastic decline, and Katrina culminated that. But now we're trying to rebuild, and we're trying to reach our community for Christ. And so my story that I'll share with you today is a little bit about how I would say that God prepared me for where I am today. You're not here by accident. The relationships you make while you're here in New Orleans, if you're not from here, the things that you learn, the church that you invest in or involved with, that will all shape you for what God wants to do in the future of your life if you'll be obedient to Him, if you'll take advantage of the things He puts in front of you. So I want to challenge you to recognize that your future depends on today. What you're doing right now will shape your effectiveness in the future. So I was born in North Louisiana, but when I was 2.5 years old, my parents moved to Liberia, West Africa. How many of you know where Liberia is? Okay. Anybody know anything about Liberia? Ebola. What?
Ebola, right?
Ebola, yes. We had about 10 or 15,000 people die from the Ebola crisis recently. The epidemic has passed, but it really hit the country hard. What else? Anything else? That's probably the most known thing Liberia is known for. Liberia is the only uncolonized country in Africa. All the others were colonized by Britain or Portugal or Spain or Belgium. Liberia wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because it was founded in 1822 by freed slaves that went back from Liberia, from the U.S. to Liberia. The slaves weren't necessarily originally from Liberia, they were from Africa. But they went back and settled the Republic of Liberia. So our flag in Liberia is very similar to the U.S. flag, except it has 1 star instead of 50. Our government is set up in the same way. We have a Senate and a House of Representatives, a lot of similar heritage. There were people from Greenville, Mississippi that went back to Liberia, so there's a Greenville, Liberia. Monrovia is named after James Monroe, the capital city. We have a Buchanan named after James Buchanan. We have a New Georgia for slaves that left Georgia and went to Liberia. And yet in that you also have the people that were there, the indigenous people, and all of their heritage and history as well. So the descendants of the freed slaves make up about 5% of the population. But basically they controlled the country for 150 years because they had the education, they established the country, and so they brought Christianity to Liberia, but the evangelization of Liberia only happened in a more recent time, except on the coastal areas. And so my mom and dad in 1968 took 3 children, I was 2.5 years old, and headed for Liberia. You know, now we travel a lot, and so nobody gives it a thought to say, hey, I'm going to Africa. Oh, great, have a great time, see you in 2 weeks. Back then, my parents were the first missionaries to go to Liberia that didn't have to go on a ship. They went on a plane, but everybody else had to get there on a cargo ship. And there was no internet for communication. There were no, even phone calls were unheard of for the first part of their term. And then later, I remember when a phone call, a 1-minute phone call was $8. And that was back when money was worth something. $8 was a lot of money. And so, and then you're yelling on the phone and you can't hear anyway. So when you went to Liberia, you went. And the communication, so if they went for a 4-year term, there was almost no communication other than a letter which took 3 weeks to get to the States as communication. So they loaded up three children and went to Liberia and set out to do what God called them to do. Back up a little bit and tell you about my mom and dad. My dad was born in North Louisiana to poor, rural, sharecropping parents. My grandfather was a part of the KKK. I don't know that he was deeply involved with it, but that's a very racist part of North Louisiana, and he was like the culture. None of them were Christians. My dad didn't grow up in a Christian home. And when he was 12 years old, Irene Cobb, his Sunday school teacher, invited him to church about a year before that when he was 11. And then when he was 12 years old, she led him to faith in Christ. So my dad was the first person in his family to begin to go to church and become a believer. His parents came for his baptism, and over the next 2 years, his mom and dad came to know the Lord. They walked away from things like the Klan and the alcohol and the moonshine and all the other stuff that was involved in their lifestyle and culture at the time, and they became followers of Christ. My dad felt a call to ministry as a teenager, and so he went to Louisiana College, and then after college he decided to be a summer missionary out in California. And while he was out there, God called him to stay there and go to Golden Gate Seminary. He was there at the time when Golden Gate was still in Oakland before it moved to Mill Valley, the really nice campus that they recently sold. He and Henry Blackaby were classmates there and had a long friendship as a result of that, and that's important in my story later on. But while he was there, Dad was like a fish out of water.
Does everybody know who Henry Blackaby is? Experiencing God.
So he wrote the curriculum for Experiencing God, and he's from Canada and has had a significant influence in Southern Baptist life. So we move along, and Dad's there. You know, he's like a fish out of water. He's a Louisiana boy in California. But sometimes God puts you in those places because he can't shape you where you are in the way that you need to be shaped when you're in your comfort zone, when you're around family, when you're around people. So for some of you, New Orleans is a stretch. You know, we have seminary students come to our church, and some of them, it's just a huge stretch. It's a culture shock. it's a shift. It seems different. It seems strange. But in that strangeness, God uses that to shape you, and my dad was no different. There was a guy from Liberia named Gus Marwia, and Gus Marwia had got a scholarship to come to the States and go to Golden Gate Seminary. Now that's very common. You've got international students all over this campus. But back in the 60s or late 50s, that wasn't very common for somebody from Liberia to come to the States to go to seminary. So to have an African on your campus would have been very surprising. And Gus Marwia was there, and he was in my dad's spiritual formation. Y'all have to take spiritual formations or something like that. So he was in my dad's spiritual formation group in class, and they would get together to pray every week. And Gus Marwia had the same prayer request every week. Pray for Liberia. Pray for workers for Liberia, because much of Liberia is unevangelized, and we need workers. And so my dad, as the good Christian he was, prayed for them regularly. And one day, the Holy Spirit began to stir in my dad's heart. Why are you praying for something that you can do something about? Why are you just praying for it, and why are you not willing to do something about it? And God began to stir my dad's heart. Quick insert. My mom is from Knoxville, Tennessee. She surrendered to ministry as a 12-year-old girl, ended up at Golden Gate Seminary because she heard that was a mission-minded seminary to go to. The first week she was there, she met my dad, and 3 weeks later they got married. So I'm not recommending that as your method, but I always told my dad, you know, I'm going to meet somebody and 3 weeks later and get married. And he said, if you're 26 and you're not married, go ahead. And so, but anyway, they met, they got married, and my dad had no calling to missions, but my mom did. But my mom told my dad, you don't have to have a calling for missions, but you do have to tell me that you're willing to go anywhere God leads you. If you'll be obedient to God, then I trust God to take us to where we need to go. And Dad had no idea of being a missionary. But he did have an idea that he was willing to say yes to God, whatever God wanted him to do. About a year later, he's with Gus Marwia, and Gus says these things, and Dad feels a stirring of the Spirit. So he writes the International Mission Board and says, do you need missionaries in Liberia? I'm willing to consider going. He didn't know what else to say. Got a letter back saying there's no missionaries from the IMB, Foreign Mission Board in Liberia right now, but we'll let you know in the future if work opens up there. And I could spend 2 hours telling you about how God used that work to be opened up and used Southern Baptist and the relationship there. But 2 years later, 3 years later, Dad was back in Louisiana pastoring a rural country church when he got a letter from the IMB. We now have work in Liberia. Do you still feel the call of God? And that was the beginning of a journey for them that would change their life. They responded back, yes, we're still willing, still interested. One thing led to another, and they made a commitment to go to Liberia about the time I was born. And about 2 years later, they actually left to go to Liberia. My mom and dad spent 30 years in Liberia, West Africa. That's where I grew up. That was my home, in a rural part of Africa, rural part of Liberia. The Mano and Gio people at that time were considered unreached people. They were below 2% evangelized, and they were much lower than that. There were very few churches, evangelical churches there in Liberia at that time, among those people groups. The only churches that were there were primarily churches of the Americo-Liberians, or the descendants of the freed slaves. The government officials who were serving in that area would set up a church because they were Christian, but most of the indigenous Liberians were not Christians, and not only that, but they didn't have churches in their language, and the gospel was not in their language. And so there were other mission groups there as well, other missionaries, along with Mom and Dad, but in their area, they were the only ones. And so they served there for 30 years. And they went through a really good early period from a peace standpoint. But then in 1980, they had an overthrow of the government, and about 20 government officials were taken to the beach, strapped to poles, and shot. I was in high school at the time. It was on TV. It happened just down the road from my house. A lot of my classmates were children of those government officials. And so it was a pretty shocking thing to happen in Liberia. And that started a downhill pattern for Liberia. The overthrow, and then you had the Civil War that started in 1989. Picture this. Liberia is the size of Tennessee. Liberia had about 4 million people, maybe 3.5 million people. And in their civil war, which lasted 15 years, 250 to 400,000 people were killed. Think about that. This is in the 90s. So in the 90s, 400,000 people were killed in a country the size of Tennessee, and most of you probably didn't even hear about it or had no clue. I mean, think about that for a moment. 400,000 people. It's along the scales of the genocide in Rwanda. And so it turned Liberia upside down, and there are a lot of reasons why it happened. A lot of internal reasons, a lot of external reasons, a lot of kind of Cold War kind of reasons, outside forces competing for interest in Liberia. But the bottom line is it destroyed the country. And through all of that, my parents served there as missionaries. They went through some wonderful times, and they went through some very difficult times. Some bad things happened to them because of the war and different things. But they were there until about 1999, and then they retired. They went back once after that. Civil War lasted from 89 to about 2004. I tell you all that because I want you to understand that God works and uses you sometimes better in difficult times than He does in times of peace. In other words, the Spirit of God can do things in adversity that He can't do in times of comfort. My dad, I would say that he probably averaged baptizing 150 to 180 people every year in the 30 years of his ministry. The greatest growth of his ministry was during the time of the coup through the end of the Civil War. I just finished my doctoral dissertation a couple of years ago, and I wrote about the evangelization of the Mono-Ngio people. And I went back to where Mom and Dad served, and I surveyed every Baptist church in that region. There are now 150 Baptist churches and church plants in that region, in Mono-Ngio. Originally there were about 7. All of those were in English. Maybe they had a Bible study in Mono-Ngio. Now there are 150, and that doesn't include the other denominations that are there. I've just focused on the Baptist churches. There are 150. And listen to this. Over 50% of those churches were started during the Civil War. And one of the reasons for that was Liberians would come out of the village and come to the city and get an education. And then when they got an education, they got a job, and they ended up staying in the cities. But when the Civil War happened, it attacked the cities the hardest. And so people fled the cities to save their life and find livelihood. And a lot of them ended back up in the villages of the place where they were born or where they came from. And so it was like the diaspora opposite. In the book of Acts, the disciples faced persecution, and they left Jerusalem and took the gospel with them. In this situation, the students went to the cities, found the gospel, and ended up coming back to their villages, which were steeped in tribal religions and animism, and they brought the gospel back with them. And when they got to their village, they would look around and say, there's no church here, and they would start a church. And then they would see the next village and say, there's no church there. And places that missionaries had worked really hard to start churches and were unsuccessful because of the cultural barriers, where the barriers were broken down by the war and broken down by indigenous Liberians planting churches in those places. Probably 1/3 of those 150 churches were started by somebody that was a part of my dad's ministry at some point at the church that he led. Now here's the funny thing, and I don't want to contradict Dr. David Platt and his staff at the IMB, and I know that they have reasons for doing what they do, but my dad wouldn't qualify as a missionary today probably. Number one, he doesn't have the ability to learn languages. He tried as hard as he could. Now, Liberia, they speak English as a general language, but then they have tribal languages. And if you go with the IMB now, you're expected to learn the language. If you can't learn the language, they don't send you. Dad never could learn the language. Not only that, but Dad's spiritual gift is in pastoring. And as missionaries, they want missionaries to be church planters and evangelists, not pastors. And so my dad served as a pastor for 20 years of one church in a city. And that would be unacceptable today. They wouldn't keep you on the field, generally speaking, unless they made an exception. But that was Dad's gifting, and God put him at the right time, at the right place, so that all of those churches that are now being started in that region, those guys grew up as teenagers and young people in my dad's church and were discipled and taken through theological education extension courses, so they're grounded in the Word, grounded in evangelism, grounded in the truth. And so now the ripple effect is across that part of Liberia. Not only that, but there are guys planting churches in the United States that were in my dad's church back in the 70s and 80s. And it's not about my dad as much as the importance of being consistent and being faithful over a long period of time. 30 years of investing in people's lives, even when the turmoil comes and the church is destroyed and you're in a refugee camp and all those things that happen with a civil war. The consistency of your presence in teaching the Word and walking with people lays a foundation for what God is going to do next. And that's so important. That's what shaped my ministry, shaped my life, shaped my calling, to understand that we are called to disciple people, invest in people, build relationships, teach them the truth, and be an active part of sharing the gospel. And so I saw that growing up, and now I'm having the opportunity in doing my dissertation to actually study it and say, I can prove this. I can show how this happened. I can show how God worked. And nobody could have planned that strategy. My dad didn't sit back and think, oh, I hope we have a civil war, but he responded faithfully in the situation that he was, and God used it for His glory. And so that was the environment that I grew up in. My parents now live here in the city. They're actually in Luling, and both of my parents have Alzheimer's. My mom usually doesn't recognize me. They're in a memory care facility about near where I live. When I go see her, she doesn't recognize me. My dad still does, and he just doesn't have any short-term memory. And that can be a very challenging situation. But every time I go see them, I always take my phone, and my mom can still sing. If you know anything about Alzheimer's, it affects your brain, but it doesn't affect the music part of your brain. I don't understand why that is. But I can ask Mom, what's the first word of Amazing Grace? And she can't even respond. She can't tell me. It doesn't connect. But I can start playing, I would say singing, but I'm a lot of times off key and she doesn't pick it up. So I play it on my phone, and when I'm playing it, she'll just start singing because it's embedded in her brain. She was our worship leader in Liberia for all those years. And we'll sing those songs, and as we're singing those songs together, I'm reminded of what faithfulness does. They're in anonymity in a memory care facility in Luling, but I've got almost a 300-page dissertation to tell you that their faithfulness produced fruit. That God took two ordinary, simple people from rural parts of Louisiana and Tennessee, people who didn't fit, and dropped them in Liberia, West Africa, and said, I've placed you here for 30 years with your kids, and I'm going to do great and mighty things through you that you could never imagine. And that's an amazing, incredible thing. More than anything else, it shapes who I am today because I saw the faithfulness. I love Eugene Peterson's book, Same Obedience, Obedience? Same Obedience in Long Direction, something like that. Anyway, I can't think of the title. It slipped my mind. But just that idea of obedience in the same direction for a long time. Being faithful to God over a long period of time. Being obedient to what He calls you to. If you are being introduced to ministry in this class, I cannot stress how important having a long view of obedience in the same direction is. Did you get that? What is it? Yeah, I never can remember exactly how the words go, but it's so important to have that long-term view. When I came to Williams Boulevard, I didn't know anything about New Orleans. But when God said this is the place, in my mind, this is the place for a long time. I don't anticipate that God will interrupt that And I don't have a short-term vision for that. I have a long, now God can do anything He wants. He can interrupt it tomorrow and change the direction. But my purpose, my perspective, my vision is always in a long direction, because I think that is what makes you effective in ministry. If you think your preaching will carry the day, I've got news for you. Very few people are gifted in such a way that their preaching is so impactful that that's enough. Most people in ministry, regardless of how good they speak or lead, have their greatest impact in ministry through consistent relationship, consistent sharing Christ, consistent discipleship. It's not about being in charge. It's not about preaching every Sunday. It's about the people and how you relate to them. Transition. The Lord led me to pastor after I finished seminary. He led me to pastor a church in North Louisiana. Probably the most unlikely place culturally for me. I went from living in Africa and being part of diversity in the world and living in Fort Worth for my seminary experience, and then going to a rural, racist North Louisiana community and church that was just as far out of my comfort zone as I could imagine. I spent almost 8 years there. During that time I met my wife, learned to love the people, learned that God wants us to be faithful wherever He places us, and embrace the community. And I learned to embrace that part of North Louisiana. I learned that just because I'm not like them doesn't mean that I can't be a part of them. And so I poured myself into that place. And that's where I began to learn to be a pastor. After 8 years, during that time I met my wife, we got married, and we felt like God was calling us to missions. Again, God has funny ways of doing things. When I asked my wife's father for her hand in marriage, he said two things. I got to understand, Mr. Matt's a good guy. A guy with a lot of integrity. He's a Christian. He loves the Lord. And he told me two things. He said, don't mistreat Amy. Well, I would never do that, because Mr. Matt makes knives, and he'd probably get one of those knives after me if I mistreated her. But then the second thing he said, don't take her to Africa. Well, I'm sitting there in their living room thinking, okay, what do I say now? And he didn't prep me on that one. And so I told him, I said, Mr. Matt, I promise you, I will never take your daughter where she doesn't want to go, and I'll never take us anywhere that God doesn't lead us. And that halfway satisfied him. He gave me permission, but he wasn't happy about that part. And about 3 years later, God began to stir in our hearts that it's time to go to Africa. So we began praying for my father-in-law. The IMB has a magazine called the Commission Magazine. And so Amy ordered it for her father for Christmas to try to, soften him up. And we just dropped hints and stuff, and they never bought the hints. And so we went to Africa, and we took their at the time, just one grandchild, and the second one was born there. We took their grandchild to Africa, and their whole family is in North Louisiana. So it's not like they travel or go anywhere. They're all from the same place, and they weren't happy about us leaving, and it was my fault. While we went to South Africa to do church planting and sports evangelism. Spent 2 years in Rustenburg, South Africa, working in South Africa and Botswana, doing primarily church planting and evangelism using sports as our platform. While we were there, our second son Gideon was born, and so my in-laws couldn't take it anymore and decided they had to come and see the grandkids. And God, again, has a way of using life circumstances for His glory. So they came to see their grandkids, and guess what happened? They fell in love with Africa. They fell in love with missions. We were sitting in this township, starting a church. We were sitting out in front of this little tin shack. And we had about 30 people gathered, and no running water and electricity, little pump to get water, and we're having church there, and people are singing from their heart, just singing to the Lord. And I look over there, my father-in-law is just crying, tears rolling down his face. And that was a turning point in his life. That changed him. It helped him to realize that God has called us to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Missions and ministry aren't separate. They go together. Before we left, my father-in-law asked me, he said, there are a lot of lost people here. Why do you have to go to Africa? And I said, Mr. Matt, you're right. There are a lot of lost people here. That's why God has you here but there's also a lot of lost people there, and he needs us there. But he didn't understand that. But then when he sat in front of that tin shack and saw the Holy Spirit at work, it opened his heart. And he embraced it, and he loves missions and wants to go and supports us. And it changed everything. You know, when Dr. Key was talking about going on a mission trip, that's why you go. Because God can tell you some things on those journeys that he can't tell you sitting at home with people who know you as you are. He's got to take you out of your comfort zone to reshape your thought process. And he did that not only for us, but he used us then to reshape Amy's parents and give them a greater vision in their walk with God. So we served 2 years in South Africa, working among the Setswana and the Setswana Botswana people and the Setswana South African people. So there's a border that divides the people group, but the people group is on both sides. So our calling was to a particular people group on both sides of the border, and so we did that for 2 years. At the end of that 2 years, we didn't know what was next, and we were praying. We were ISC, which is a International Service Corps, which is one of the designations or titles they give a particular position with the International Mission Board. It's a 2-year assignment. It basically is a preparation. We didn't know if we wanted to be career missionaries, so we went as 2-year missionaries with the intention of, at the end of that, becoming career missionaries. Again, long story of how God worked, and we felt like we'd end up in Africa, but God had different ideas, and he decided to send us to Canada. Never been to Canada, barely seen snow. A couple of inches here and there. Louisiana snow is all I'd ever seen. And so a guy up in Canada called us, and we began to have a conversation, and he said, look, I need you to come do church planting in Alberta, Canada. Be our coordinator for the region, and we don't have any money. You're going to have to raise your own support. We might be able to get a little bit of money from them, but you're going to have to raise your own support. But there's a lot of lostness here, and we need churches, and will you come? My parents had always been with IMB, and IMB provides a salary for them. I'd never raised my own support. I didn't know about all that, but God gave us a sense that this is where he needs us. Again, there's a whole story about our understanding of why God was calling us there. But we loaded up. By then we had 2 kids. Yeah, we're only at 2 at that point. We loaded our 2 kids up, and we have a car with a little U-Haul behind us and everything we own in it. Here's a good ministry lesson. A good ministry lesson is if it doesn't fit in your trailer, you probably don't need to take it with you. One of the things in ministry that we need to wrestle with is how complex are our lives and how much does stuff matter to us. I know people who have storage stuff in every place they've ever lived, and it's still there in storage. You know, at some point you just got to leave stuff and let it go and take what you need and just a simple lifestyle. And so we had everything in that trailer, mostly not because we had a lot of stuff, that's all we had, but it taught me the value of just living with what I need. So we loaded up that trailer and went to Canada. We got there in June, and it was snowing. Did I tell you I'd only seen like 2 inches of snow in my life? I didn't know it went below zero. I mean, theoretically, I did know it goes below zero, but do you know how cold 40 below zero is? Anybody been in like that kind of weather? Okay, where have you been?
I was up in Nebraska.
Okay, that is stinking cold. I can describe a lot of what it does to you, but I mean, we had never experienced anything like that. And it's like, God, I've got all these years in Africa. Why did you dump me in Canada? Understand that a lot of times God will put you in places where it doesn't seem like it fits. In hindsight, some of our best years in ministry were those 7.5 years that we spent serving in Canada. We filled that role. We were there doing church planting. We also started a church ourselves called Big Rock Baptist Church, and then we supervised all the church planting in Western Canada. The last 3 years I was up there, I taught at the seminary. I was the Nehemiah professor of church planting, so did that for 3 years. And the irony of that is the guy that I worked with as a pastor and then later as the seminary president was Dr. Rob Blackaby. Dr. Rob is the nephew of Henry Blackaby. And my dad and Henry were friends in seminary and were friends for all of those years. And I met him, but I didn't know much about him. I knew when he wrote Experiencing God, and I used that curriculum at my church, and I had a lot of respect for him. But then all of a sudden God drops me in Canada, and they introduce me to the pastor of Trinity Baptist Church and say, this is the guy you're going to work with, and it's Henry Blackaby's nephew, Rob. And today he's one of my closer friends in life and in ministry. And it was just amazing how God orchestrates all of that. And so what you have to do is, again, long direction and big picture. Ministry is never about where you are and what you're doing and right here and right now only. So many different things feed into that. It's important to understand that on the front end so that you're building relationships and you're investing in places because you know that God is faithful to then use this for His glory, and at the same time He uses it for His glory, He will use it in your future for His glory as well. We served up in Canada for 8 years and were a part of planting churches up there. And Canada is the opposite of Africa, and not just in the cold weather sense. The coldness, the unreceptivity, I don't know what the right word is, but the lack of receptivity to the gospel. It's a very tough place. You know, in Liberia, we go in a village and set up the Jesus film, and we would have 20 or 30 people afterwards wanting to talk about it and then sharing the gospel with them, beginning to disciple them. And we never had difficulty. Even now, when I go back to Liberia, I go back almost every year doing ministry. We have an orphanage we work there with, and we're still helping plant churches. We're trying to reach some new areas in surrounding countries and counties. And we never have a problem with receptivity. People are open to the gospel. Go to Canada, and it's a tough place. Very cold, very slow. I can say that in 8 years, I can count on one hand how many homes we were invited to for a meal. Now, if you know my wife, Amy, she's a very hospitable person. She loves a party. She loves having people in our home. She invites people over. We have people regularly in our home for meals, whether our neighbors or our church family or whoever. People have lived with us. Seminary students have lived with us in the past. Up in Canada, we had summer missionaries live with us. I mean, our home is open, and that's how we were in Canada. And yet, even with all of our openness, it was never reciprocated because that's not their culture. I mean, they got to really, really know you to invite you into their backyard to have a barbecue. Inside the house, not so much. You never end up there. And so it was a much more challenging time of ministry, much more slower growth. And one quick story about the church we started. Had this great idea. We'll start on Easter Sunday, and we're going to mail out. We had a town of about 30,000. There were 20,000. There were no Baptist churches there. One or two other evangelical churches, heavily Mormon. And so we decided we would saturate the town with a mail out. We got a church to sponsor it, and we mailed out flyers to all the every home in Okotoks, inviting them. And we had a school that we were rented, and on that first Sunday, we had met a few weeks before that to get ready, but on that launch Sunday, do you know how many visitors we had? Close. We had 0 goose egg. And not only that, but the handful of people that we had, a portion of them didn't come. And I learned a valuable cultural lesson. You know what lesson I learned about Easter up there? It would be like, a better way to describe it is, what if you decided to launch a church on Thursday, on Thanksgiving, at Thanksgiving lunch at noon, and you mailed out a flyer to the whole community and said, come to our service at noon on Thanksgiving Day. Not only would people not come even if they wanted to because they have family commitments, but some of your regulars won't come because they have family commitment too. Easter is like that in Canada. It's not at least in Western Canada. It's not a religious holiday. It's a family holiday. It's like Thanksgiving. They celebrate Thanksgiving in October, but not to the level we do. So their kind of Thanksgiving or their family gathering really is Easter. and nobody came. Now, over the next several weeks, we had some visitors come that said, I got your flyer, and I wasn't able to come, and that was the beginning. But it was a slow go. I mean, with all the work we did for the launch and all of that, I would say we gathered 10 people over the next 6 months. But God was faithful, and we slowly grew the church, and when we left, we were able to give it to a Canadian pastor who ironically has now, because of his health issues, had to pass it on, and a guy from Bogalusa, Louisiana is now the pastor of the church. And so, but God worked in all of that. All that to say that God puts you in different places in ministry, and if you think you know what your path in the future is, you're probably wrong, and if you're right, you probably didn't trust God enough. He called you to go to some places, and you stayed in your comfort zone. And so all of that has shaped me and shaped my life and my family's life. And so when I ended up at Williams Boulevard Baptist Church in this diverse community, Kenner is the most diverse city, according to demographics, in the state of Louisiana. They have more diversity there than any other city in Louisiana. And that's perfect for me. I love it. I love the context. I love the fact that it's a mission field. I love the fact that we have an opportunity to reach so many people and begin the process of their family coming to faith in Christ. I'm not afraid of the slowness of it. When I meet somebody that comes out of a traditionally Catholic background and is very resistant to hearing the gospel, maybe they're not involved even in the Catholic Church and they're just resistant all the way around, I'm okay with the slowness of that because God prepared me for that in Canada. But I'm also excited when God just opens the door and the floodgates are there, and just realizing that this is a spiritual moment. God prepared me in Liberia for spiritual warfare, being able to recognize that in our community here because of what I saw growing up in Liberia. So I think it's important to recognize that ministry, missions, they all are woven together. And yes, we need to take people on mission trips and emphasize local ministry and emphasize a calling to the pastorate, but to recognize that it all works together and God uses it for His glory if we'll be obedient and be open to His calling. We had 2 kids born in Canada, and we have 1 son born in South Africa and 1 son born in North Louisiana. And so we are a global family, and that in its in the back seat of my car. We were in Canada. We lived about an hour from the hospital, and it was time. And so we jumped in the car, and it was snowing, and I was going 100 miles an hour, and it was through a national park, and there's elk and deer, and Amy's hitting the back of the seat, go faster, and finally she says, pull over. So we pulled over and had the baby in the back seat of the car. And I want to tell you, my brother has 9 kids, and only 2 of them adopted, 7 of them their own, 1 of them born in a hospital in Nepal, all the rest of them born at home. And so he called me and asked me after the fact, he said, did you have a birthing kit? I said, Kenneth, if I knew I needed a birthing kit, I would have moved into the hospital 6 months before. There is not anybody more unprepared to birth a baby in the backseat of a car than me. The moment I started to gag, my wife looked at me and said, you better not, because she knew. And I didn't, and we had the baby. We have a lovely daughter that we didn't expect, and God blessed us in that way. But so, all of those things are used for God's glory. And so that's one of the exciting stories in our life.
I'm going to ask you
Yeah.
specific questions and then go from there. Can you tell the story of the tree?
Okay, yeah. So go back to Liberia. There's a guy named Moses Moses Wambiaka. He's in a little village called Komple. La Pia #1 is his village. And Dad baptized him. I was a part of his ordination back in '91. And he became the most significant church planter in that region. I would say that God used him more than anybody else more recently during the war for planting churches in that area. So I went back to work with him in his village. And I would go back every year, and not every year, but close to every year. This is after the Civil War, and this event happened in his village between one trip and the next trip. In Liberia, back in the old days, 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was a lot of witchcraft, a lot of animism, and when they started a new village, they would start the village with a human sacrifice. And they would sacrifice the niece of the chief who was going to start the village. And they would plant a tree in the place that they sacrificed her. Now, that ended for the most part back in the 50s, but historically that was true. So any village in the part of Liberia where I'm from that you go to, almost any village that's pretty old, you'll see a huge cottonwood tree. And that cottonwood tree is that tree. That's where it was planted, and that's the story behind it. Not in every situation, but generally speaking, that was true. In Moses' village, it was true, and so that cottonwood tree became the hub of the witchcraft of the village. So when Moses goes back during the war and realizes that there's no church in his town, he starts a church. It really grows. He's very evangelistic. And because of the war, the cultural fabric of the village broke down, and so he was very successful in reaching people. So the church grew so rapidly that all of a sudden you had this huge conflict between the rich witchcraft people in the church and the people that had come to know the Lord. And the witchcraft stuff with the cottonwood tree was causing a lot of problems. And so finally, Moses got a group of men from the church, and he was one of the village leaders. He went to the chief and the village council and said to them, this tree and all this witchcraft is hurting our people. We want to cut the tree down. And they no way. And so Moses challenged them. They did 3 days of prayer and fasting before they went and had this conversation. And Moses challenged them. He said, why don't you want us to cut it down? They said, oh, you wouldn't be able to cut it down. The witchcraft in that tree is too strong for you. And Moses said, well, if that's true, then why do you have to defend the tree? Let the tree defend itself. Let us cut the tree down, and if the witchcraft will stop us and something bad happens, we're okay with that. And if we don't, we cut the tree down, it means our God is stronger. Kind of like the Old Testament story, prophets of Baal. So they set Easter weekend as the weekend to cut it down. They spent some time praying and fasting. I want to tell you, that tree was bigger around than maybe 3 of these tables. I'll let you and direct you to where you can see a picture of the tree. Huge tree. And all they got is this old chainsaw. And they worked for 2.5 days, starting on Good Friday, to cut that tree down. And he said it was a mess. Cottonwood's a really hard wood, and so it would break the chains and all that kind of stuff. But there was a lot of spiritual stuff going on as well. He said literally they would cut the tree and it was hanging like that, and there was no logical reason why it wouldn't fall, but it wouldn't fall. But right before sunset on Saturday of Easter weekend, the tree fell. And the village, the leaders were shocked. Why did you cut the tree down? And, but they went back to, if the tree had no power, then why would you allow it to continue to be a source of witchcraft in this village? And as a result of that, they had to, when I went back the next year, they had expanded their church by another 30 feet because they'd had another 100 people get baptized in that year. So if you were to Google on YouTube, Cottonwood Tree, Liberia, you'll see a video of me and Moses, me interviewing him about that, and there's some pictures, I believe, in that video of the cottonwood tree. And that happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and so it's up on YouTube, and you can see that. Love Liberia is another video that's up there. I took a mission team over there from another church, and all of that happened during that time. But that was an amazing thing. So a couple of years ago, a guy came from Houston, wanted to plant a church, and his heart was to be similar to a church in Texas where they were one church in 2 languages. They didn't want to plant a Spanish church. They wanted to plant a church within a church because of the problem that you run into with second generation. A lot of your second generation speak English, sometimes more so than Spanish, and they need to be incorporated into the church they feel comfortable with. So he didn't want to start a separate church. He wanted to plant a church within a church or be a part of our church. And so God opened that door, and we planted that church about 3 years ago. If you go on Saturday night to Williams Boulevard, you've got about 250 Spanish speakers worshiping on Saturday night in our facility. And that's one of the things that God had put on my heart from the very beginning is we've got to reach the community. 30+% of the people in Kenner are Spanish speakers. And it's not just Spanish speakers, it's Hondurans. There are over 100,000 Hondurans in greater New Orleans area. The number one Spanish-speaking group in greater New Orleans is Hondurans. If you go to Houston, it's by far and away Mexicans. There are many other nationalities there, but Mexicans are the predominant there. Here, the predominant is Honduran. And Pastor Yanni is from Honduras originally. He came over here not as a believer. He came over here, like many others, illegally and just to work. And he found the Lord, and he ended up getting married, has a family. He's here legally now, and he serves as the pastor of Grace and Restoration. And God has used that, and it has been a stretch for our church. You know, because you start sharing a facility, and it's not always clean, and things get left the wrong way, and there's a conflict, and just trying to teach our church and help our church to understand we're all in this together. And so we try to do some things together from time to time. It's a challenge with language barriers, but we try to do some things that bridge those gaps, because our goal, again, it's a long direction, in the same direction. We have a long view in the same direction. We know down the road where we need to be and where God wants us to be. And so some of the challenges that we put ourselves in today may seem more difficult. It may be easier not to do that. But some of the churches that are shutting their doors because they chose the easier rather than the Christ-centered way to do things.
Do you have a final just challenging word regarding you're going to have pastors, you've got youth ministers, you've got everything probably in this room represented, but from a missional standpoint, as a final word.
Yeah. I'll use a quick story to give that final word. And 4 or 5 years ago, Trent Bullino came to Williams Boulevard from, I thought it was South Georgia. Harris corrected me and told me it's Middle Georgia, but rural Middle Georgia. And when Trent and Candy came, they were like fish out of water in New Orleans. They came, they planned to go to seminary, probably end up back in Georgia pastoring a rural community church. Instead, while they were here, they immersed themselves at Williams Boulevard Baptist Church, and they fell in love with the city. Candy ended up teaching in St. Bernard Parish, and they served God faithfully here and got to know our people, poured themselves into the church, and through that process, God began to put a calling on their heart to go to Wyoming. They've never been to Wyoming. They've never seen the Rockies. They've never been in that kind of weather, but God put that on their heart, opened some doors for them to go and experience that while they were here. And so when about 2 years ago now? 2 years ago, Trent did what Amy and I did many years ago, and right here on the seminary campus, he loaded up a U-Haul with all the stuff they had and headed up to a dying church, a struggling church in a small town called Lyman, Wyoming. And he went up there and has begun the revitalization process. A church that was running 20 or 30 and now running 60. It's in a heavily Mormon area. They've invested themselves in that community, and they're growing in the Lord. And not only that, but because of what he did while he was here, our people fell in love with him. And so we have sent mission teams up there. We had a group of men go up there and help them renovate one of their building spaces for children, and we've got a college team going up to do a winter VBS and maybe some skiing afterwards in January. But all of that is because of the investment in relationships in the church where they were while they were here. And so their investment here was not done with that in mind. They were being authentic, living out their faith here, but in doing that, God built relationships through that for them that now assist them in their ministry. And so we've been a great partner for them because we love Trent and because we can be a part of that ministry and we can help him along the journey. But he earned that. That doesn't just happen. One day you're going to be in ministry somewhere and you're going to need something. And God is going to use previous relationships and previous investments and sacrifice. Look, Trent just took care of our building. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't hardly teaching. He was just taking care of our building and not making much money doing that. But it's what we could give him. The first year we didn't even give him anything. We didn't have it to give. But he poured himself into our church, and he was sacrificial, and now God is using that to bless him and bless us as well. And so what I would say from a ministry perspective is wherever you're planted, be sure that you're all in. If you're a part of a church in New Orleans area, and you should be if you're heading in ministry, you need to be all in. And you need to love the people and invest in them and be sacrificial and show them what it is for a person who says, I'm called of God, to be a servant. Like the devotional at the beginning, being that slave. Trent was our slave in a lot of ways. He did all the dirty work. And the result of that is that God has used it not only for his glory, but to bless Trent and his family along the journey. And so I would say to you that if you're not pouring yourself in where you are because you got a vision of what God's going to do in the future, you're going to be disappointed about the future because you will have lost the resources that God had prepared for you today. So invest well wherever you are. Don't be scared to go where God leads you, and it's always to the glory of God. Even when you're old and have Alzheimer's and think nobody remembers your name or knows where you are, God knows. And God knows what he's done in and through you. So thank you for letting me share, and I always enjoy coming and having an opportunity.